The clatter of cutlery grates on my nerves, a soundtrack to a life lived in shadow. 30 years. 30 years I've been breathing the same air as the Kingsleys. And for what? To be the goddamn afterthought, the plan B they shove into the dusty corner of their perfect little life when their precious Daisy needs a manicure. Daisy! The very name makes my teeth ache. 27, and still Daddy's little princess. If Daisy wanted the moon, Dad would build a rocket himself. Me? I wanted a goddamn flashlight when the power went out, and I got told to check the fuse box. That's how it always was, unspoken, understood. Daisy got, I earned. She reigned. I survived. It wasn't just toys and trinkets, the childish squabbles you expect. It was everything. Daisy wanted a sleek, cherry red bike with gears I couldn't even pronounce. Mom and Dad practically tripped over themselves to get it. I wanted a bike? Save your allowance, Leo. Hard work builds character. Daisy never saw the inside of a grocery store checkout lane until she was 20. I was bagging groceries at 14, trying to cobble together enough cash for jeans that didn't have holes the size of golf balls. 16. Sweet 16. Daisy got a pearl white convertible, ribbons tied around the rearview mirror like she was winning some goddamn beauty pageant. I got a bus pass. Driving is dangerous, Leo, especially with the night shift you'll be working. That was fine. Anything to prove myself. Look, I'm responsible, Dad, anything to prove it. Anything to warrant a scintilla of their attention. She never lifted a finger. Not a single, solitary finger. Meanwhile, I was drowning in homework, babysitting screaming toddlers and slinging lukewarm coffee to miserable office workers, just so I didn't look like a charity case in the hand me downs Daisy outgrew. College? Don't even get me started. Daisy breezed through, her every whim catered to. Full tuition, a swanky apartment downtown, a bottomless supply of textbooks she probably never opened. Me? Mountains of student loans, ramen noodles for dinner, and the constant, gnawing fear that I wouldn't be able to make rent, let alone graduate. I spent more time in the library than my dorm room, my back aching, my eyes burning, and my heart a lead weight in my chest. I worked my tail off to maintain a 3.9 GPA. Honors. Dean's List. I clawed my way through every obstacle, every sleepless night, every skipped meal, just to prove. What? That I was worthy? That I deserved a sliver of their attention? Graduation day arrived. I pictured them there in the crowd, beaming, proud. I imagined Mom crying happy tears, Dad clapping until his hands were red, Daisy even cracking a smile for me. I had proven myself now, right? But when I scanned the sea of faces, my eyes searching, frantic, they weren't there. The rows of folding chairs were indistinguishable, but none were inhabited by my mother, father, or sister. They were too busy, you see. Daisy had another one of her genius business ventures. A goddamn organic dog biscuit bakery that would inevitably crash and burn within 6 months. And apparently, that took precedence over my years of sacrifice, my hard-won achievement. The tears welled and spilled. I smiled for the pictures, shook hands with professors, and accepted my diploma with a hollow, aching heart. I spent years trying to earn their love, financial help when they were strapped, rides to appointments, listening patiently while Mom ranted about the neighbors and Dad droned on about his failing business. I always made time for them, even when they couldn't be bothered to return the favor. But no matter what I did, Daisy was always the sun, and I was just a forgotten asteroid drifting in the outer reaches of their solar system. Then came Emma. She changed everything. She was real. She saw me, not the shadow of Daisy, not the disappointing son who wasn't good enough. She loved me for who I was, flaws and all. Her love was a life raft in a sea of indifference, a beacon in the endless night. When I proposed and she said yes, my chest swelled. We would be happy together. Our wedding date arrived, and the planning was hellish, a constant reminder of the lack of support, I knew they wouldn't be truly there for me, but a wedding felt different, felt like something they would show up to. I wanted my parents in the front row, watching me walk down the aisle. I wanted Daisy standing somewhere in the crowd, at least pretending to be happy for me. They promised. Oh, they promised. The organ music swelled, and I took a deep breath, trying to ignore the tremor in my hands. Emma was radiant, a vision in white. As I stood at the altar, I glanced at the seats I'd carefully reserved for my family. Empty! Barren. A gaping hole in the fabric of the day. My stomach churned, bile rising in my throat. Maybe they were just late. Traffic! A last-minute emergency. I clung to the hope, praying they'd burst through the doors any second, breathless with apologies. I could almost hear Mom's frantic explanation, Dad's embarrassed cough, Daisy's nonchalant shrug, but the moments stretched into an eternity. The vows felt like a blur, Emma's hand a reassuring anchor in the storm raging inside me. I smiled for the cameras, focused on her beautiful face, tried to pretend that everything was okay, that the absence of my family didn't matter. It mattered. God, did it matter? Every stolen glance at those empty seats was a fresh wound, a sharp, stinging reminder of my place in their lives. Less than nothing. I wasn't even worth the effort of showing up. The tears started to rise again, and I bit the inside of my cheek. The reception was a haze. I laughed, danced, made small talk, but a cold, hard knot of anger was settling in my stomach, threatening to consume me. I kept looking back towards the entrance, a desperate, pathetic hope flickering in my chest. But they never came. Not a call, not a text, not a goddamn thing. Just empty seats and deafening silence. Days later, when I finally managed to reach them, Mom's voice was sharp, impatient, like I was inconveniencing her. Leo? What is it? We're busy. My wedding, I choked out, the words laced with bitterness. You missed my wedding. There was a pause, a tense silence that stretched on for too long. Then, Mom sighed, a dramatic, world-weary sigh that I'd heard 1,000 times before. Oh, Leo, don't be so dramatic. It wasn't a big deal. Not a big deal? My voice rose, cracking with emotion. I got married, Mom. This was supposed to be one of the most important days of my life, and you couldn't even be bothered to show up? Daisy had a little emergency, she said, her tone dismissive. Her cat was sick, and we couldn't just leave her alone. Honestly, Leo, you always overreact to things. She pronounced it so clearly, like I was a broken record, and she was just explaining it one more time to the man-child I was. I didn't even want to dignify it with an answer. The fucking cat! A cat took precedence over my wedding. Over me. My father, ever the silent observer, cleared his throat, a sound that spoke volumes. He thought this was all a waste of time, a childish tantrum. You should understand, Leo, he said, as if that was the end of the conversation. We thought you'd understand, he mumbled, as if I should have understood that family pets were more important than major milestones. Understand, as if I was the one being unreasonable. Then Daisy spoke, her voice dripping with condescension. You're not actually mad about this, right, Leo? It's not like it really matters. That was it. Something snapped. Years of resentment, of being overlooked, of being treated like I was invisible, finally boiled over. The anger, the grief, the pain, it all coalesced into a blinding rage. You're right, Daisy, I said, my voice dangerously low. It doesn't matter. None of it ever matters to you. I'm done. I hung up, blocked their numbers, deleted them from social media. For the first time in my life, I cut them off. A clean break. I expected them to fight back, to bombard me with calls and texts, begging me to reconsider. I even imagined Dad showing up at my door, a rare moment of paternal concern etched on his face. But nothing. Silence. Complete, deafening silence. It was as if I'd ceased to exist. Months passed. No calls, no texts, no apologies. Nothing. They didn't even notice I was gone. The silence stretched on, an oppressive weight on my chest. I tried to focus on Emma, on building our life together, on burying the past. But the ghosts of the Kingsleys lingered, haunting my dreams, whispering in my ear. Then, a few weeks ago, my Aunt Clara called. I hadn't spoken to her in years. She was Mom's sister, a kind, well-meaning woman who always seemed a little overwhelmed by the drama of our family. Her voice was hesitant, uncertain. "Leo," she said. I wasn't sure if I should even tell you this." My stomach clenched. "What is it, Clara?" "Things aren't going well," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For your parents and Daisy. I can't really go into details, but maybe it's time to talk. Maybe you should give them a chance to explain." My first instinct was to refuse, to slam the phone down and block Clara's number too. I'd given them enough chances. They'd squandered every single one. But something shifted in my mind, a flicker of, what? Curiosity? Hope? No, not hope. Something darker. I told myself it was about closure. That maybe, just maybe, I needed to hear them acknowledge what they'd done, to hear them apologize, to admit that they'd been wrong. But deep down, I knew it was something else. I wanted to see if they'd changed, if they had any regrets at all. And if they didn't, then at least I'd have my answer. "Okay," I said, my voice flat. "I'll meet them. One time? One chance. But that's it. That's all they get." Clara sounded relieved, her voice trembling slightly. "Thank you, Leo." I hope it works out." I doubted it. I knew the Kingsleys. They were incapable of admitting fault. They were masters of denial, but I agreed to the meeting. I set the terms, a neutral location. No drama, just a conversation. They didn't know it yet, but depending on what they said at that table, I was either walking away for good, or I was about to make them regret everything. The next week I would meet them and unleash the demons I'd been holding at bay for far too long. They had been given enough chances. Now, they would face the consequences. The restaurant was buzzing with activity. The clinking of glasses, the murmur of conversations, the aroma of garlic and basil filled the air. It was the kind of place the Kingsleys would have frequented back when they were playing the part of the successful, happy family. Now? I doubted they could afford it. I scanned the room, my heart pounding a dull, heavy rhythm against my ribs. There they were, huddled in a corner booth, looking exactly as I expected, tense, uncomfortable, like they were facing a firing squad. My mother, Evelyn, was the first to spot me. Her eyes widened and she forced a smile, the practiced, artificial smile she used when she was pretending everything was fine. The smile that said, "Don't you dare ruin this for me." Daisy was slouched back in her seat, arms crossed, staring at her phone, her expression bored and petulant, like she had better things to do than face the wreckage of her own life. Her latest failing business had been a disaster. My father, Richard, barely looked up. He was scrolling through something on his phone, his face impassive, detached, the same expression he wore whenever he wasn't interested in something, which, let's face it, was most of the time. I walked over to the booth, pulled out the chair across from them, and sat down. No greetings, no forced pleasantries, no hugs, just silence, thick and heavy with unspoken accusations. Evelyn was the first to break. She launched into a stream of small talk, asking about my job, if Emma and I were thinking about buying a house, if I had any vacations planned, like nothing had ever happened, like they hadn't ignored my wedding, like this wasn't the first time we'd seen each other in nearly a year. I didn't answer. I just waited, my gaze fixed on her face, watching her squirm. Daisy finally looked up from her phone, a smirk playing on her lips. "Wow," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "So you're still mad about that wedding thing?" She leaned back in her seat, like this whole thing was one big joke. The air shifted. The restaurant noises faded into the background. My hands clenched into fists under the table. I had to stay calm. I wasn't here to lose control. I wasn't here to cry or beg for answers. I was here to see if they were capable of acknowledging the pain they'd inflicted. "Do you even realize why I'm upset?" I asked, my voice even controlled. Daisy rolled her eyes and sighed, like I was being so unreasonable. Evelyn gave one of her dramatic sighs and shook her head. "Leo, you always overreact to things. We had a family emergency. We can't drop everything for you all the time." "A family emergency?" I stared at her, waiting, giving her a chance to say something, anything that would make it make sense. That would explain their absence, their indifference. "Nothing. You're talking about Daisy's cat," I said, the words laced with disbelief. "You missed my wedding because of a cat," Daisy scoffed, as if that wasn't the full story. "It wasn't just that," she said. "I wasn't feeling well either." Richard, who hadn't said a word this whole time, finally looked up from his phone, just long enough to shrug and say, "We just thought you'd understand." That was when it clicked. This wasn't about a misunderstanding. This wasn't about them making a mistake or forgetting or anything like that. They just didn't care. They had never cared. I had spent years thinking that if I worked harder, if I was more patient, if I just gave them one more chance, maybe things would be different. But sitting across from them now, listening to them make excuses for something that shouldn't have needed an excuse, I knew there was nothing left to salvage. I leaned forward, making sure they heard me clearly. "This was your one chance to take responsibility," I said, my voice cold and hard. "You missed it." They exchanged confused glances, not getting it. Not understanding that this wasn't just another one of those family disagreements they could sweep under the rug. I reached into my bag, pulled out some cash, and dropped it onto the table. "You'll regret this," I said. Then I stood up and walked out, leaving them sitting there, still not grasping what had just happened. That night, I couldn't sleep. The anger was still simmering inside me, a toxic brew of resentment and pain. I tossed and turned in bed, the image of those empty seats replaying in my mind. I knew I couldn't let it go. I couldn't let them rewrite the narrative, to act like I was some dramatic, ungrateful son who just couldn't let things go. If they weren't going to be held accountable within the family, then the world was going to hold them accountable. I got out of bed, opened my laptop, and started typing. The words poured out of me, a torrent of truth and pain. I wrote everything, the years of neglect, the blatant favoritism, the way they treated Daisy like a princess while I was left to fend for myself. And, of course, I included the final insult, how they had RSVP'd to my wedding and then ghosted me for a cat. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't embellish. I just told the truth. When I was finished, I read it over, my heart pounding. This was it. There was no turning back. I took a deep breath and clicked post. Then, I waited. At first, nothing. A few likes, a handful of comments from people saying they could relate. But then, overnight, it started gaining traction. Someone must have shared it in a large group, because suddenly, notifications flooded my phone. More comments, more shares. People were tagging each other, reposting it, adding their own stories. I thought I was the only one. My parents did this to me too. I cut my toxic family off years ago. Best decision I ever made. By the time I checked again that evening, it had taken off in a way I never expected. Thousands of comments poured in, many from people who had been through the same thing. The post wasn't just being read, it was spreading. Like a wildfire, the spark had been lit. The next morning, I woke to a phone buzzing incessantly. The numbers were all unknown, but I knew exactly who it was. Evelyn. I silenced the phone, a grim satisfaction settling in my stomach. But the calls didn't stop. All day, my phone pinged with missed calls and voicemails. The text started with simple messages, "Call me now," but soon escalated into full-blown rage. "Take it down immediately. You are making us look bad. Do you have any idea what you've done? I blocked Evelyn. Next came Daisy. A long, furious message came through, filled with all caps and exclamation points. Are you serious? Do you know how embarrassing this is? My job might see this. YOURE literally ruining my life. Apparently, she cared more about her reputation than the fact that she and our parents had completely disregarded me. I blocked Daisy. Richard, as always, was silent. No calls, no texts. He had always been the one to avoid conflict, to pretend that problems didn't exist if he ignored them long enough. But as the fallout grew, even he couldn't stay detached forever. When Evelyn's frantic attempts to control the damage failed, he finally reached out, not with an apology, but with an attempt to smooth things over. A single message, let's be reasonable. Reasonable? After a lifetime of being treated like nothing, he wanted to be reasonable? I blocked Richard. The support came pouring in. Strangers messaged me, some thanking me for sharing my story, others telling me they were going through the same thing. Some people even gave me advice, sharing how they had successfully cut off their toxic families for good. Then my Aunt Clara texted, "Wow, Leo, I didn't think it would get this big. But honestly, I can't say I blame you." She didn't defend my parents. She didn't try to convince me to take it down, just an acknowledgement that this was bigger than she had expected. By that evening, things had taken a turn. More calls, more messages. Then, the real fallout started. The family gossip train was in full motion. Extended relatives started hearing about it. Friends of my parents, even their old church group. Questions started coming their way. People wondering if it was true. Then, Daisy called. The moment I picked up, she was already yelling. Someone at my job saw the post. They confronted me about it at work. Take it down. Her voice was shaking, not from anger, but from panic. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I just said one thing before hanging up. The truth hurts, doesn't it? Then came the guilt trip. Evelyn sending voice notes, her voice breaking. You're destroying this family. After all we've done for you. This is how you treat us. As if they had ever done anything for me. I ignored them. Every single one. Then, Richard finally broke his silence. One single phone call. His voice was flat, controlled, like he was trying to act like this was no big deal. You've made your point. Now, let's be adults and move on. Move on? After a lifetime of being treated like nothing? Adults take responsibility, I replied, just as calm. You didn't. Then I blocked him too. It was over. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I needed their love, their approval, anything. I didn't need them to admit they were wrong. I had something better, regret. But I wasn't finished. The post had done its job. It had exposed their behavior, but now it was time to make sure everyone knew exactly who they were. I opened my laptop and started drafting an email. Not just to my parents. Not just to Daisy. To every extended family member. To old family friends. To anyone who had ever believed the Kingsleys were good people. This wasn't just about exposing them. It was about making sure they could never rewrite the story again. This time, the truth wasn't going anywhere. The email went out. Aunts, uncles, cousins, old family friends, anyone who had ever been fed the lie that my parents were good, loving people. I didn't hold back. I laid everything out, detailing the years of neglect, the blatant favoritism, the way they treated Daisy like a princess while I was left to fend for myself. And, of course, I included the final insult, how they had RSVP'd to my wedding and then ghosted me for a cat. The responses came in fast. Some relatives were shocked. Messages poured in from cousins and distant aunts, saying they had no idea it was this bad. Others were less surprised, subtly implying they had always suspected something was off but didn't want to get involved. Then came the reactions from my parents' so-called friends. One of their longtime family friends, a woman Evelyn had been close with for years, reached out, horrified. She couldn't believe they had missed my wedding over something so petty. Another messaged me privately, saying that while they had always liked my parents, this changed everything. That's when my phone started blowing up again. Evelyn was in full meltdown mode. Missed calls, voicemails, frantic texts, all saying the same thing: what have you done? People are turning against us. This isn't fair. She was losing control of the narrative and she knew it. Then, Richard lost his indifference. For the first time in years, he actually showed real emotion. Not concern, not regret, just rage. A voicemail came in, his voice shaking with anger. You ungrateful brat. You've ruined our reputation. You have no idea what you've done. I let the message sit there. I didn't respond. While they were dealing with their social lives falling apart, Daisy was dealing with something much worse. A cousin messaged me privately, revealing something I had suspected for a while. Daisy had been mooching off my parents for years. The whole successful businesswoman act was just that, an act. She wasn't self-made. She wasn't independent. My parents had been quietly covering her rent, her car payments, even some of her credit card bills. And now, with their reputation crashing, her free ride was in serious danger. Then came the work fallout. Someone from Daisy's job, a coworker, maybe even a manager, must have seen the viral post because HR got involved. Turns out, her company took their reputation seriously. A meeting was scheduled and Daisy was furious. Another angry call came through. She was screaming before I even said a word. You ruined my career. Do you even care? I waited until she ran out of breath, then asked one simple question. What part of this isn't true? Silence. Then a muttered curse before she hung up on me. Meanwhile, Evelyn was desperate to get ahead of the damage. She started sending out her own emails to extended family, painting me as some bitter, exaggerating child who was holding on to the past. She tried to spin it as if I was making a big deal out of nothing, twisting the narrative into one where she had simply made a few parenting mistakes. But this time, no one was buying it. Instead of siding with her, most of the family now saw the Kingsleys for who they really were. The ignored messages, the favoritism, the missing wedding. It was all documented. So Evelyn tried one last thing, a public apology. A long, overly dramatic Facebook post went up, filled with vague wording. She wrote about how she wasn't a perfect parent and how some people take things out of proportion. It was a classic non-apology, a way to make herself look like the victim while still refusing to take any real responsibility. I didn't even have to respond because everyone else did. People started calling her out in the comments. Distant relatives started questioning her. Some of her own friends were openly disagreeing with her, saying that if she had really cared, she would have shown up to my wedding. But I wasn't done. I posted receipts, screenshots of texts they ignored, a picture of my wedding day, with the glaringly empty seats where my family should have been, proof that for months they never even tried to reach out. And that was it. More people cut them off. Family group chats that once included Evelyn removed her. Invitations that once went out to the Kingsleys suddenly disappeared. Daisy was spiraling. The HR meeting happened. No one knows exactly what was said, but whatever it wasn't good. A week later, word got around that she had been put on probation. Another angry call came in, but I didn't answer. The next message I got from Evelyn was her last one. A final, desperate attempt at guilt-tripping me. You'll regret this when we're gone. I didn't respond because, for the first time, I realized something. I wasn't doing this for revenge. I was making sure they finally felt the consequences of their actions. And it was working. The fallout wasn't just social, it was financial. And the cracks were starting to show fast. A call came in from an uncle I hadn't spoken to in years. He wasn't reaching out to guilt me, but to warn me. My parents weren't as stable as they had made it seem. They had been struggling financially for a while, but instead of cutting back, they had poured everything into Daisy, keeping up the illusion that she was successful. It turned out that Daisy hadn't been paying her own rent at all. My parents had been covering it the whole time, along with her car payments, credit card debt, and whatever else she couldn't handle on her own. The money they were spending on her wasn't just casual help, it was their retirement fund. They had banked everything on Daisy, eventually becoming successful enough to take care of them. Except she never did. And now, with her job on shaky ground and their social circle turning against them, the financial house of cards was collapsing. Daisy's job probation meant she wasn't getting bonuses anymore. Without her usual paycheck, she couldn't cover her lifestyle. The rent on her apartment was due, and this time, my parents couldn't step in. Then, the first eviction notice came. Her landlord wasn't interested in excuses. With rent prices going up and no guarantee of payment, Daisy was put on a final warning. If she didn't come up with the money soon, she was out. Meanwhile, my parents were facing their own nightmare. They couldn't keep up with their mortgage anymore. The loss of social standing had impacted more than just their friendships. It had hit their business connections too. Richard had always prided himself on his reputation in the community, using his standing to keep his side gigs going. But now the invitations had stopped coming. People were eager to work with someone whose personal life was a disaster. Then the house went up for sale. The place I had grown up in, the house where I had been treated like an afterthought, the house where Daisy had been spoiled and handed everything. They had been under financial strain for a while. Between their reliance on credit cards to support Daisy's lifestyle and Richard's dwindling income, foreclosure was inevitable. They tried to hold on, even borrowing from old friends. But with their reputation damaged and their safety net gone, they were forced to downsize, moving into a much smaller home in a less desirable neighborhood. The kind of move that screamed, "We're struggling," even if they refused to admit it out loud. That's when I got the email. A long, emotional plea from Evelyn, disguised as a message of reconciliation. She didn't apologize, of course. Instead, she focused on how family should stick together, how no matter what, we'll always be connected, and how I was doing so well now and could help them through this tough time. I didn't hesitate. I replied with one sentence. "I thought you said I was being dramatic and overreacting. If you can't take responsibility for what you did, why should I take responsibility for you now?" Then I blocked her email. The meltdown was immediate. She tried reaching me through other numbers, leaving voicemails filled with rage, calling me ungrateful, accusing me of abandoning my own family, claiming that one day I'd regret this. I didn't respond. Then Daisy tried. Unlike Evelyn, she didn't waste time pretending to be nice. Her message was blunt. "You wouldn't let your sister be homeless, would you?" As if she had ever cared when I was struggling. I picked up the phone for the first time in weeks and said one sentence before hanging up. "You never cared when I had to fend for myself. Welcome to my world," click. Blocked! The situation only got worse for them. People in their social circle started whispering. The news of their financial issues spread. But instead of sympathy, it became gossip. People talked about how they had brought it on themselves, how they had burned bridges for Daisy, how they had betrayed their own son and ended up with nothing. I had my suspicions. The way my parents had clung to their old social circles, the desperation in my mother's texts, it all hinted at something more than just embarrassment. Then another call came in from my uncle. This time he confirmed it. They weren't just struggling socially, they were drowning financially. They had relied on Daisy to be their golden ticket, but her failure and their lost reputation had left them with nothing. That's when Richard, the man who had never fought for me, never defended me, finally broke his silence. The single message, "I hope you're happy now." No apology, no accountability, just blame. I didn't reply. I didn't need to because, for the first time in my life, I felt something I had never felt before when it came to them. Nothing at all. No guilt, no sadness, no regret, just relief. I turned to Emma that night and said, "I'm officially done with them. No more looking back, no more hoping they'd change." and for the first time in my life, I meant it. Daisy's eviction wasn't immediate. At first, she tried negotiating, pleading for more time, hoping that someone, anyone, would step in to cover her. But when the final warning came and the landlord wasn't budging, reality finally hit. This time, there was no last-minute miracle. No sudden money from my parents. No one to bail her out. The landlord followed through. Daisy was kicked out of her apartment, bags in hand, with nowhere to go. Her first instinct was the same as always: run back to mommy and daddy. But this time, they barely had enough to cover their own rent. The new place they had downsized to wasn't big, wasn't nice, and most importantly, wasn't free. They couldn't afford to support Daisy anymore. And for the first time in her life, she was forced to figure things out on her own. She tried couch surfing. A friend let her crash for a few nights, but Daisy was Daisy, entitled, demanding, acting like she was doing them a favor by staying there. It didn't last. One by one, every option dried up. The messages from Evelyn slowed, but they never stopped. At first, it was anger. Then guilt. Then silence. And then, out of nowhere, a final, desperate email. Not an angry voicemail. Not a passive-aggressive jab. Just a simple plea. Please. We have nothing left. We need you. Not I'm sorry. Not we were wrong. Just we need you. I read it once. Then again. Then, for the last time ever, I responded, you made your choice. Now, live with it. And then I blocked her emails, numbers, social media, everything. They no longer existed to me. And instead of guilt, I felt lighter than I ever had before. The silence was peaceful. No more unexpected calls. No more tense family holidays. No more waiting for an apology that was never going to come. I had finally cut the last string. Then came Richard's last pathetic attempt at controlling the narrative. A Facebook post, some long, dramatic rant about disrespectful children who abandoned their family, about how kids today have no loyalty and only care about themselves. It sat there for days. Not a single like, not a single supportive comment. People had seen the truth. Meanwhile, Daisy's situation didn't collapse all at once. At first, she managed to convince a friend to let her crash on their couch for a few weeks, but her entitled attitude, complaining about the Wi-Fi, expecting food to be provided, wore thin fast. One by one, her options dried up. Even her closest friends started seeing through her. Her entire life had been built around her parents covering for her, fixing things for her, but now there was no safety net. And I wasn't the only one who saw it. My aunt and uncle, two people who had stayed quiet for a long time, reached out. Not to pressure me, not to guilt me, but to tell me something simple. We're proud of you. They had watched it all unfold. They had known my parents weren't great, but they never realized just how bad it had been. And now they saw it clearly. And that was all I needed to hear. The months passed, and something strange happened. For the first time in my life, I wasn't dreading the holidays. No awkward family dinners. No waiting for a call that wasn't coming. Just peace. Then one day I did something I never thought I would. I went back to my wedding venue. I stood in the same spot where I looked out at the empty seats that were meant for my family. I took a photo, standing right there with those seats behind me. And this time I smiled, because they were the ones missing out. Not me! Emma noticed the change immediately. You've never looked this happy before, she said. And she was right. Without them in my life, I was thriving. A month later, I hit a huge milestone at work. A big promotion. A career move I had worked my ass off for. Once upon a time, I would have called my parents, told them the good news, waited for some kind of pride, some kind of validation. But now, I didn't even think about calling them. They had been erased from my world. Of course, Evelyn couldn't let things end that cleanly. A new email came through, not from her usual account. She knew she was blocked. This time, It was from a distant cousin. I opened it, scanned the first line, and immediately recognized Evelyn's wording. Deleted. No hesitation. No curiosity. No second thought. She had already said everything that mattered. Nothing. And Daisy? Last I heard, she had to move out of state to find work. No more easy rides. No more parents covering her mess. No one cared. And that was it. Looking back, I realized something. I never needed revenge. I just needed them to finally experience the consequences of their own actions. And they did. Even after cutting them off, the messages didn't stop. New numbers, unknown contacts, some guilt-trippy, some outright hostile. The pattern was always the same. First came the family is forever lines, trying to manipulate me into responding. When that didn't work, the messages turned nasty. I ignored them all. Then, a cousin reached out with something interesting. My mother had made a fake Facebook account. Apparently, she wasn't handling being blocked well. So, she did what desperate people do, created a profile under a random name, and started lurking. She wasn't subtle either. She kept posting vague, cryptic statuses like, "Some people just don't understand what family means." People weren't stupid. It didn't take long for mutual friends to piece it together. Some even called her out in the comments. The account disappeared not long after. But Daisy? She tried something even more ridiculous. She went full victim mode. Out of nowhere, she posted a long, dramatic rant on her real social media, flipping the narrative completely. According to her, I had ruined her life and abandoned my family for no reason. She painted herself as a devoted sister who had always tried to support me and acted like I was the selfish one for cutting them off. It backfired spectacularly. The internet doesn't forget. People remembered who she was. They remembered the entitled, arrogant girl who never worked for anything. The girl who bragged about being better than everyone. The girl who treated people like they were beneath her. The comments tore her apart. Instead of sympathy, she got mocked. Then, silence. No more sob stories. No more fake narratives. Just a public humiliation that she couldn't erase. Then, late one night, a random number called. I let it go to voicemail. A single message. Richard's voice. "We need to talk. It's urgent." I stared at my phone for a long moment before texting back. "What's wrong?" Not even a minute passed before another text came through. But not from Richard. It was Evelyn's number. Oh, thank God you're finally coming to your senses. There it was. The bait and switch. I already knew what this was about. But I waited. Another message. Not a health emergency. Not a family tragedy. A financial crisis. They were out of money. Richard had been struggling to keep up with bills. Evelyn's reputation was in the gutter, meaning her old support network had dried up. Daisy's eviction had already happened. And now, with nowhere left to turn, they were begging me for help. Just a little help. "We're family. We need you." I replied with one sentence. "You never treated me like family. You don't get to ask me for anything now." Silence. Then, the breakdown. The messages came rapid fire, one after another. Evelyn lost it, flipping between guilt-tripping and full-blown rage. "How could you do this? You're selfish. You'll regret this one day." Then, Richard called again. This time, I picked up. He started talking, but I didn't let him finish. "You only care because you have nothing left. That's not love. That's desperation." Then I hung up, blocked every new number they tried reaching me from. That night, Emma and I went out to dinner. We toasted to something that had been a long time coming: peace. No more unwanted messages. No more guilt. No more waiting for something that was never going to come. A few weeks later, a cousin confirmed what I already knew. My parents had to sell the house where I had grown up feeling like a second-class family member. The house where Daisy had been spoiled and handed everything, while I had to work for every little thing I had. They lost it, and I felt nothing. because they had made their choice, and now they were living with it. Daisy's downfall was inevitable. Her job had put her on probation after the fallout from my viral post, but everyone knew what that really meant. It wasn't a second chance. It was the company waiting for the right moment to cut her loose. And that moment came. HR finally pulled the trigger. Daisy was officially fired. No more cushy paycheck. No more pretending to be successful. Nothing. That's when the couch surfing phase began. She started bouncing between friends' places, but Daisy was Daisy, lazy, entitled, and unbearable to live with. She wouldn't pitch in for groceries. She wouldn't help clean. She acted like crashing on someone's couch was her right, not a favor. One by one, people kicked her out. With nowhere else to turn, she tried guilt-tripping our extended family. Aunts, uncles, even distant cousins. She spun the same old sob story. Leo abandoned us. My parents are struggling. I just need a place to get back on my feet. Nobody took her in. By now, the family knew the truth. They had seen the way she was coddled, the way my parents had thrown their own retirement away for her. Nobody was going to repeat their mistake. With the guilt-tripping failing, Daisy tried one last social media pity party. A long-winded post about how families should never turn their backs on each other, how she had been left with nothing, how her own brother ruined her life. It was the exact same playbook Evelyn had tried. And just like hers, it failed. People remembered who she was. They remembered the entitled, arrogant girl who never worked for anything. The girl who bragged about being better than everyone. The girl who treated people like they were beneath her. The comments tore her apart. Instead of sympathy, she got mocked. Then silence. No more sob stories. No more fake narratives. Just a public humiliation that she couldn't erase. Meanwhile, my parents had become pariahs. Once they had a strong social circle, friends, neighbors, even their church community, but after everything that had come out, that support vanished. Nobody invited them to events anymore. The church, which Evelyn had relied on for validation, had turned their backs on her. People stopped returning her calls. Even her closest friends distanced themselves. Then came the ultimate humiliation, a family wedding. A big one! The kind of event where Evelyn would have once been front and center, playing the role of the respected matriarch. But this time, nobody cared that she was there. She tried acting like nothing had happened, smiling, making small talk, inserting herself into conversations. But people ignored her. Not in a cruel way. Not in an obvious way. Just in a way that let her know she wasn't welcome anymore. A few people gave her fake smiles, the kind you give to someone you don't respect, but also don't want to make a scene with. She left early. Then I saw a photo of Richard, a random picture that made its way to me through family. He looked different, older, tired, defeated. The weight of everything, the financial ruin, the social exile, the loss of control was written all over his face. Then, the final blow hit. With nowhere else to go, Daisy moved back in with them. 3 people broke, bitter, and barely scraping by, trapped under the same roof. A family built on favoritism, now turning on each other. And me? I felt nothing. I had expected to feel triumphant, to feel like I had won, but mostly, I just felt free, because they had no control over me anymore. Then, Daisy sent her last message ever. A single text. I can't believe you're just watching us suffer like this. I stared at it for a second. Then, I typed back one last reply. Welcome to my childhood. Blocked. It's forever. Then I did something I never thought I'd do. I deleted every last contact from my phone. My parents, Daisy, every number, every email, every trace of them. They didn't exist in my world anymore. And for the first time in my life, I was finally truly free. A cousin reached out for what would be the final update I'd ever receive about them. My parents had officially hit rock bottom. The house was gone. Their savings were drained. and they had no choice but to move into a tiny, run-down apartment. The kind of place they used to scoff at. The golden child was still with them. Daisy, once the center of their world, was now a grown woman with no job, no prospects, and no way out. She was stuck in a dead-end life, completely dependent on two parents who barely had anything left to give. The family had cut them off completely. No more holiday invites, no more birthday parties, no more fake smiles at weddings and reunions. They had alienated everyone. Even their old friends had moved on. Nobody wanted to be associated with them anymore. Meanwhile, I was thriving. Another promotion, more traveling, the kind of life I used to dream about when I was younger. Stuck in a house where I was constantly overlooked. Then something poetic happened. One of my best friends got married. This time, there were no empty seats, no disappointment. I stood beside someone who valued me, who wanted me there. The wedding was beautiful, full of love, laughter, and real family. I didn't spare my parents a single thought. At the reception, Emma leaned over and said, "I've never seen you this happy before." And she was right. The holidays came and went. No unwanted calls. No awkward conversations. Just peace. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel that familiar pang of sadness when family gatherings rolled around, because the truth was, I wasn't alone. I had a wife who adored me, friends who were like siblings, a real family that I built for myself. Then therapy gave me the final answer I never realized I needed. It wasn't me. It was never me. I had spent so much of my life thinking that if I just tried harder, if I just earned it, maybe they would have loved me the way they loved Daisy. But the truth was, they were never capable of it to begin with. I stopped checking for updates on them after that. Their lives were not my concern. I had bigger things to focus on, like the family I was about to build. Emma and I started talking about the future, about kids, about what kind of parents we wanted to be, and we both agreed we would never be like them. Then one last unexpected thing happened. A package arrived. No return address. Just a plain old box. Inside, a collection of childhood photos. Old pictures of me at Christmas, birthday parties, random family moments that I barely remembered. And buried beneath it all, a letter from Evelyn. I didn't open it. I didn't even hesitate. I picked up the box and tossed it straight into the trash. No curiosity, no second thoughts, because at that moment, I knew it was truly over. They were nothing to me anymore. And the best part? They had done it to themselves. They had made their choice. And now, I was living my best life while they faded into irrelevance.